She is water. She is moonlight. She is the womb from which all life sprang. Before the arrival of colonisers, before history was written in ink instead of smoke and drum beats, there was Atabey, the Taino goddess who carried the stars in her breath and the ocean in her eyes. Hello and welcome to Ladies of Lore, the podcast where we take all of the most wonderful women from mythology and folklore from all over the world and we unpick, unravel and explore their origins, their stories and how they've changed through time to arrive in today's modern world. I'm India and I am so grateful to have you here with me today. If you are new to the podcast, welcome on in. I really hope you like it here, and if you do, please do consider following or subscribing on your favourite podcast platform. You can also follow me over on Blue Sky and TikTok, the links to which are in the show notes as per usual. And now we also have the Ladies of Lore Patreon, which is there if you want to check it out. The free tier includes Discord server access, and it would be amazing to see some more of you in there for a little chat. We also have other things. We talk about our pets, we talk about food, and there are some fun things like writing prompts and things like that, and there's a book club. But if you want to look at that, please do check it out. And I have just released the very first episode of Heroines of History on Patreon too, where I talk all things Cleopatra. So do check that out if you're interested. Everything, as I say, will be in the show notes. But anyway, on to the point of today's episode, and that is to talk about a new mythology that we haven't covered yet here on the podcast, Taino mythology. And today we're going back into the water again to meet one of its most powerful deities, Atabey, the primordial mother, goddess of fertility, fresh water and the moon. And this one was suggested by Val Freya over on the Discord server, and I'm so excited to unpack something new. So thank you so much for this suggestion, and I hope you enjoy it. Now, if you're ready and if you're comfortable, let's jump in. Atabey is one of the central deities of the Taino people, the indigenous inhabitants of the Caribbean, primarily what we now know as Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, Cuba and the Bahamas. And you might be wondering who the Taino people are. So before I go into too much detail about Atabey herself, I'm going to tell you a little bit about them just to help give you some context. And it's always helpful to sort of colour in the edges, so to speak. Now, as I said, they inhabited the Caribbean, and they were actually at one point one of the most numerous indigenous people there, probably hitting around 1 to 2 million at the time of the Spanish conquest in the 15th century. And they actually were the first Native American group encountered by Christopher Columbus during his 1492 voyage, and their legacy is deeply embedded in the cultural, linguistic and spiritual fabric of the Caribbean. The Taino belonged to the larger Arawakan linguistic and cultural family, which originated in the northern regions of South America and gradually migrated into the Caribbean countries before the European contact. And they developed sophisticated agricultural systems cultivating staple crops like cassava or yucca, maize, beans, squash and sweet potatoes. Cassava was particularly central to their diet and to their cultural identity. And also the god Yugahu, who is the son of the very goddess that we're discussing today. He was actually believed to sort of govern the growth and abundance of cassava or yucca. Socially, Taino society was highly organised with hierarchical structures based on cacicazgos or chiefdoms, led by chiefs who were both political and spiritual leaders. The Taino lived in large communal dwellings called bohios, which were constructed with sort of wooden poles and had palm thatch roofs. And I'm gesticulating as if you can see what I'm doing, but you get my drift. It's a big pole with palm thatch roofs. And their villages often surrounded a central Bati, which was a ceremonial plaza used for public gatherings, games, rituals, and dances known as aretos. And these rituals included music, storytelling, and performances that preserved oral traditions and honoured ancestral spirits, and it was at these places that stories of deities were told. And their religious lives revolved around animism and a rich pantheon of spirits and deities known as zemis. And these zemis were represented through carved figures made of wood, stone, bones, and clay, and they were considered living embodiments of divine or ancestral power. The Taino cosmology emphasised harmony with nature and cycles of life, with gods and goddesses linked to natural elements like water, wind, fertility, agriculture, and death. And the sacred and the natural were pretty much inseparable in their worldview. They went hand in hand. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later on in the episode, but as I'm sure you can imagine, the arrival of Europeans marked quite a catastrophic shift from this way of life. And within a few days of Columbus's landing, the Taino population was decimated by a combination of things. So you had diseases like smallpox, you had brutal colonial violence, forced labour under the encomienda system, and displacement. Spanish colonisers declared the Taino people extinct by the mid-16th century. But this wasn't entirely true. Though greatly reduced and dispersed, Taino bloodlines, cultural practices and oral traditions survived through intermarriage with Africans and Europeans, particularly in rural and mountainous areas. And today, there is a vibrant cultural revival among Taino descendants in Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic and Cuba, and in diaspora communities in the US. Genetic studies have confirmed that many Caribbean people carry Taino ancestry, and indigenous leaders have begun to reclaim their language, their spirituality, and their identity. And the modern Taino resurgence is both an act of resistance and remembrance, asserting the continuity of a people once declared vanished, but still singing the old songs to the beat of the ancient drum. And if you want to read a little bit more about these people, I have included a few articles that I found while researching, and they go just into a little bit more detail than I have here, and they're really great reads if you're interested in learning a bit more about colonisation and indigenous people. Right, now let's talk about Atabey. Now you know about the culture and context within which she existed, and we'll start with the beginning. So Atabey emerged from the worldview of the Taino that I just told you about, and it's one deeply rooted in the rhythms of nature, where gods and spirits were not distant, omnipotent beings, but they were rather intimate forces, and they existed within things like rivers and mountains, caves, and the moon. And Atabey, in this cosmology, is the mother of all, not just in a symbolic or metaphorical sense, but as the actual source of creation and the essence of life itself. According to Taino mythology, Atabey existed before time began as an eternal creative force, and she's often described as a self-generating deity, a divine mother who brought forth life from her own being. She didn't need anyone else to help her to create life. In some stories, she births her son Yukahu without any male counterparts, and he's a kind of immaculate creation that underscores her self-sufficiency and her cosmic authority. And Yukahu would go on to be the god of cassava, as I said, and of agriculture, and he was central to the survival and prosperity of the Taino people. And Atabey's other son, Guaca, represents the chaotic counterpart, jealous and withdrawn. He flees or vanishes, and he's a shadowy presence in the mythic narrative. Atabey's essence is linked to water in all of its life-giving forms: rivers, lakes, rainfall, and underground springs. She is the source of fertility, governing both the literal fertility of the land and the reproductive cycles of women. She was the goddess that women turned to during childbirth, praying for safe passage between life and death. The moon was her celestial symbol, reinforcing her connection to cycles, both monthly and seasonal, and her control over tides and emotions. And caves were also sacred to the Taino, and Atabey was believed to live in or emerge from these liminal spaces. In origin myths, the first waters and spirits came from a cave, and Atabey's maternal body was often envisioned as a bit of a landscape itself, with these sort of womb-like caverns and flowing springs that symbolised her nurturing spirit. And these stories were not written down, but they were passed orally through ritual, song and sacred ceremony, and they were performed in community gatherings, and they were often actually led by women. And Atabey's origin isn't just mythic, it is ecological and also psychological. She's born from the Taino understanding that all life comes from water, that all women carry life just as the earth does, and that the moon above echoes the tides within. Her creation story is less about chronology, and it's more about essence, really. She always was there. As long as there was breath, as long as there was water, and as long as there was the will to live, she has always been there. And descriptions of what she actually looked like come primarily from a combination of oral tradition, early colonial accounts, and archaeological artefacts uncovered in the Caribbean. But because the Taino, they didn't use written language in the way that Europeans did, for instance, so there's not any definitive textual description of Atabey from the pre-colonial period. Instead, what we know of her visual form has been reconstructed through carvings and petroglyphs, which are sort of etchings or scratchings on rock surfaces, and there are some really interesting ones of Atabey, which are going in the show notes so you can have a little look. And also interpretations by anthropologists and indigenous scholars help to sort of make this composite image of Atabey from all of these different fragmentary references to how she might look. So what I'll tell you is sort of, a composite image. Atabey is often represented as a powerful female figure, deeply connected to the earth and water. In many sculptures and petroglyphs, she's portrayed with broad hips and exaggerated genitalia, emphasising her role as the giver of life and fertility. Fertility, I said that really funny, didn't I? I'm just going to leave that in. These features are not sexualised in a modern sense, but they're more there to sort of highlight her creative and reproductive powers. Some depictions show her squatting in a birthing position, and that is a really symbolic stance which connects her directly to childbirth and regeneration and like the flow of life. And that pose is not actually unique to Atabey at all. It's been seen across various indigenous and earth-based spiritual traditions, including some we've covered before, but in the Taino context, it specifically reinforces her as this cosmic mother. And what I found really interesting is that in certain iconographies, Atabey takes a bit of a dual form, both maternal and lunar, and there's that duality of women back again. And she's sometimes rendered with facial features that resemble the moon, marked by rounded lines, gentle eyes, and a more sort of serene expression. And I guess in this context, she becomes a celestial figure. She's watching from above and regulating not just tides, but also human emotion and feminine cycles. And the moon was also incredibly sacred to the Taino, and Atabey's lunar form symbolised her role as this sort of protector of women and children. Early colonial writers such as Ramon Panay, who travelled with Columbus and documented Taino beliefs in the late 15th century, described zemis of female deities associated with fertility and lunar aspects, which many scholars interpret as references to Atabey, or sort of another bit of a composite image of all of her aspects. And there are also myths that hint at a destructive side of Atabey, or perhaps more accurately, her shadow aspect, which some believe manifests through Guabensex, who is the fierce goddess of storms and hurricanes. And some scholars and modern spiritual practitioners consider Guabensex to be an aspect or manifestation of Atabey when she's angered, especially by human disrespect for nature. And we've seen that in previous episodes where we've had these more indigenous goddesses who are extremely enraged when humans disrespect their surroundings and disrespect nature. And in these types of stories, Wabansex unleashes violent winds and floods accompanied by her helpers and the messenger of storms and thunder. And these storms were seen not just as weather events, but as expressions of the goddess's judgment and cleansing power. And there are some carvings found in Puerto Rico and in the Dominican Republic that depict her in an even more abstract form, with spirals and water motifs representing her fluid and shape-shifting nature. According to Jose Juan Arom, who is a leading scholar of Taino mythology, these types of abstract symbols reflect the Taino approach to deity representation, symbolic and elemental rather than strictly strictly anthropomorphic. There we go. In his book, Mitología y Artes Prehispánicas de las Antillas, Arom narrate... Do you know what? I actually said the Spanish bit quite well, and then I couldn't say the words afterwards because I was so excited with myself that I might have actually pronounced that right. Oh, goodness me, this is a mess today. But in his book, Arom notes that Atabey is not always rendered as a literal woman, but more as a symbolic convergence of female power, water, and celestial energy. Contemporary interpretations, especially by Taino revival artists like Samuel Lind and community leaders such as Jorge Estevez, blend these ancestral symbols with modern sensibilities, and we'll talk more about that when we go on to the modern day. Archaeological sources like those collected in the Smithsonian's collection and in regional Caribbean museums contain stone and wood zemi-figures believed to be Atabey or associated female deities, and one notable example is a stone figurine from the Dominican Republic, and that's housed in the Museo del Hombre Dominicano, and that shows a squatting woman with pronounced hips and a serene, close-eyed expression, believed to represent Atabey in her life-giving form. So, to sort of sum that all up, Atabey's appearance is best understood not through a single image, but it's through a constellation of symbols: the birthing position, the full-bodied form of motherhood, the flowing contours of water, and the gentle glow of the moon. She is visualised as sort of both a person and a presence. She's an embodiment of nature's rhythms and a living memory in the sacred art of her people. So I reckon we should all be at a point now where we're feeling like we know what she looks like and we know the context within which she lived. So I think it's time we told some significant stories about Atabey. There are several myths and stories involving Atabey, but it's really important to recognise that a lot of what survives today is the result of oral tradition, colonial interpretation, and contemporary reconstructions by Taino descendants and scholars. Like I said earlier, the Taino did not leave behind written records in the sense that we would understand today. So a lot of their mythology, including stories about Atabey, come from early Spanish accounts, archaeological interpretations, and survivor knowledge preserved in rituals, art, and revived storytelling. So everything that I'm telling you now, it is through that lens. It is not from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So just bear that in mind. But one of the most central myths involving Atabey is the creation myth of the Taino universe, where, as you know, she plays the pivotal role of the primordial mother. So I'm going to tell you that one first. Before the rivers flowed, before the trees stretched towards the sky, before the birds sang and the winds carried their cries, there was the vast and endless sea. And from its silence came Atabey. She was not born in the way that humans understand birth. Atabey was a spirit of the water, an ancient force, the mother of all creation, the one who held both fertility and the moon within her. She was not just a goddess, but a principle, a presence. In the land of the Taino, she was Caguana, the sacred force that brought life. Atabey emerged from Yaya, the great spirit of all existence, sometimes described as male, sometimes beyond gender, but always the source. In the beginning, Yaya created Yayael, his son, but Yayael turned violent and was ultimately killed by his own father. Yaya kept his son's bones inside a gourd, and from that gourd, through time, heat and sacred mystery, came the first fish, and then the waters of the sea. And this gourd became the source of the ocean and all that swims within it. From this mystery and grief, life began to take form. And it was Atabey who became the nurturer of this life. She brought order to the waters and gave form to the land. She was the waters of the earth, the fertility of the soil, and the mother of all things that grow. But Atabey was not a mother in the way that humans might expect. She was a spirit of duality. She could give life without needing a partner. She gave birth to 2 sons, not from union, but from spirit. One was Yukahu, the spirit of cassava and agriculture, lord of the mountains and provider of food. He was good, and he was generous, and the people revered him. The other son was Waka, who grew jealous of his brother and withdrew into the darkness. Yukahu became the guardian of the Taino people, teaching them how to plant cassava, how to fish, how to live in balance with the land. The cassava, which was their sacred food, was a gift directly from Atabey through her son. And it was said that each root contained her blessing, and in every bite was her nurturing spirit. Atabey herself, though often hidden from view, was not absent. Her face was the moon. Her voice was the sea. Her presence was most felt during childbirth, and when the people carved her into stone, they did not make her human. Instead, she was often shown in the form of a semi, a sacred idol, sometimes squatting in the birth position, her face solemn, her body open to the act of creation, and in some carvings, tears stream from her eyes, perhaps for her son, or perhaps for the pain of birthing the world. The Taino told their children that Atabey lived in the sacred waters, in the lakes and springs. When they bathed in the rivers, they whispered thanks to her. When they gathered cassava, they offered prayers. She was never loud, and she was never boastful. She was the quiet rhythm of the world, the cycle of the moon, the rise of the tides, the soft swell of a woman's belly as life grows within. This was the world as the Taino knew it, born from spirit, sustained by the earth, guided by Atabey. And even when the Spanish came, bringing iron and crosses on fire, the memory of Atabey lived on, whispered in the forests and sung in hidden places, because you cannot silence the sea, and you cannot erase the mother of creation. So that's the story of Atabey and the creation of the universe and the world, and it's pretty much what I've told you already, but maybe like a dramatized version. And there is another traditional tale involving Atabey, which tells of her retreat to the sky, where she becomes associated with the moon. And this one is a little bit more obscure than the other Taino myths, and again it survives only in fragments passed down through oral tradition and later reconstructed by ethnographers from the few glimpses preserved in early colonial texts. So here's a version of that tale based on what we have. There was a time when the world still felt young, when the rivers knew her name and the mountains carried her breath. In those days, Atabey walked close to the people. She was not made of flesh like they were. She was the curve of the moon, the mist on the leaves in the dawn, the hush in the jungle when everything waits. She was the mother of waters, the mother of Yukahu, the provider. She was fertility, she was tide, stillness and storm. She did not need temples, for the earth itself was her shrine. The people once felt her presence directly. When a woman gave birth, they whispered her name. When they pulled cassava from the soil, they felt her hands in the roots. She moved among them unseen, but never absent. But harmony does not last forever, even in a world shaped by spirit. There came a time when balance broke. Some say it was because of Gwaka, Atabey's other son, who turned from his brother and from his mother, burning with envy and bitterness. Some say it was the greed of humans who began to forget to give thanks, who took more than they needed, who stopped listening to the breath of the land. The world grew louder, the people grew more distant, and Atabey began to withdraw. She didn't rage, though. She didn't punish. She just pulled herself back. First, her voice stopped rising in the rivers. Then her presence faded from the stone wombs of the caves, and finally, she rose into the sky. Not to abandon the people, but to become something greater than presence. She became the moon, the great mother eye, watching, patient and distant. And now she circles above, cool and silver, not speaking, but always seen. And it is said that when she left, she did not go alone. She took with her the deep mysteries of life, those that only belong to spirits. And childbirth became painful, no longer shielded by her closeness. Storms became fierce, not balanced by her gentle hand. And yet, she left a part of herself behind in every sacred spring, in every fertile hill, in every moonlit night. The Taino understood. She had not died. She had not vanished. She had transformed. And she now lives in the realm beyond the clouds where spirits dwell, where ancestors speak in dreams. She isn't gone, only waiting, watching for when the balance might be restored, when the people might remember her songs and speak to the water again as if it were sacred. When the moon is full and the earth is quiet, some still feel her. They say the wind carries her sigh, that if you listen, not with ears, but with the soft animal of your soul, you might still hear her breath. Because Atabey never truly leaves, she simply becomes the sky. And this myth speaks to both loss and transformation, how the sacred can retreat when disrespected, but never truly disappear. And I'll tell you one more, because all the best things come in threes, and there is a sacred cave myth that relates to Atabey. So in Taino cosmology, caves were the source of life, as I said, and entrance to the spiritual world. And there's one myth that it's from a sacred cave, often interpreted as Atabey's womb, that the first humans, animals and rivers emerged. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. Long before the people lived under the sky, long before the sun cast its warmth across the land, there was only the cave. And this was not just any cave. This was the womb of the world, the place where all life waited. The world outside was dangerous, unformed, dark in its own way. Inside the cave, however, there was warmth and order. Inside the cave was Atabey. She was the breath of the cave, the spirit of the waters that trickled through its stones, the mother who cradled life in its silence. She didn't appear as a figure walking among the people, no, she was the spirit of the cave itself, the stillness in the air and the moisture on the stone walls. To the Taino, Atabey was always close, but never fully visible. In the time of beginnings, the people lived within the cave, hidden from the world, protected by Atabey's presence. She kept them there not to imprison them, but to keep them safe, to nurture them until the time was right. Some say the cave was her womb. Some say it was her heart. Either way, it was from her that all humanity would one day emerge. Two brothers, trickster spirits and the children of the first man, were impatient. The cave was sacred, but it was also a place of limits. One day, one of the brothers was trusted with the guardianship of the entrance, and he went out before the dawn, and he failed to return before the sun rose. And because of this, he was turned to stone and punished for his disobedience, a warning to others about the power of the world outside. But the world could no longer be hidden. The sun was rising. It is told that the sun and the moon themselves had once hidden in caves as well, and they were trapped in stone chambers tucked into the mountains, gifts held in secret by the spirits, or perhaps even by Atabey herself, waiting for the right time to let them shine. One day, the cave that held the sun was broken open. Some say it was the trickster brothers who did it. Some say it was Yukahu, Atabey's son, who commanded it. But once it was opened, the sun emerged, powerful and blinding, and nothing was ever the same again. Later, the moon followed, gentler but no less sacred. The people say the sun is the breath of Yukahu, but the moon is the face of Atabey, quiet, watchful and constant. Now the light had come, the people could no longer stay in the cave. Atabey released them, or perhaps they stepped out on their own, blinking into the brightness, their bodies still remembering the cool walls of the earth womb. And so humanity was born again, from stone and shadow into light. But even outside, the people never forgot the cave. It was the first home, the source, the origin. And when they carved their semis, their sacred idols of the spirits, they often gave them the shape of people crouched, as if waiting to be born. They built shrines around caves, they made offerings at their mouths, and they remembered that caves were not just holes in the earth, but sacred spaces of transition, portals between the world of the living and the world of the spirits. And they remembered that it was Atabey, the spirit of womb and water, who had held them safe in the dark. She was the mother of the first cave, the hidden guardian, the eternal watcher. Though her name might not be spoken in every telling, her presence lingers in the damp silence of the earth, in the cool hush before the sun rises. And when a Taino child is born, it was said that they too came from a cave, and from Atabey herself, brought forth from her unseen waters into the world of air and light. And there you go, there's a few stories about Atabey based on the fragments and bits and pieces that we have. I hope you enjoyed them, and I reckon it's probably a good time to talk about how interpretations of Atabey and these stories have changed through time. So we're going to be talking about colonialism again, guys. Let's go. Atabey experienced a profound transformation over time, shaped by waves of European contact, ideological shifts and colonial violence. From her veneration in the pre-Columbian Caribbean to her erasure and reappropriation in Western thought, Atabey's journey kind of mirrors the larger processes of spiritual suppression and cultural rewriting faced by indigenous cosmologies. And again, this is something that we see time and time again on the podcast. During the medieval period, Atabey was pretty much unknown to Europe and the Western world, as the Taino civilization was geographically distant from Christian Europeans' sphere of knowledge. It just didn't. We just didn't know about it over here. However, the ideologies developed in medieval Europe laid the foundation for how indigenous deities like Atabey would be received following contact. Christian doctrine at the time was built around the dichotomy of divine versus demonic and male-centric conceptions of power. Non-Christian gods, especially powerful female ones, were interpreted through a demonic lens. The church had so much hostility towards nature-based spirituality and female-centered divinity, and this created sort of an interpretive framework which would be later applied to Atabey during colonial encounters, aligning her more with threats to orthodoxy than subjects of curiosity or reverence. So I guess the transformation of Atabey properly began during the colonial period when these frameworks were applied, particularly after the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492. So Atabey, as we know, represented not just fertility, but the embodiment of nature itself, and she came under systematic attack through the Christianization efforts of Spanish missionaries. And Taino spiritual systems, which were orally transmitted and deeply interwoven with ecological practices, were classed as paganism. Missionaries replaced Atabey with the Virgin Mary in a deliberate effort to reframe her maternal aspects within a Catholic framework that emphasised submission, virginity, and passivity. And this syncretic substitution distorted Atabey's role and reduced her autonomy, and it also just suppressed her more sort of dynamic and multifaceted identity. It just pushed her down and replaced her with the Virgin Mary and all that came with that. And this is one of the ways that colonisers exercised their power. They did this through erasing spiritual symbols that connected Indigenous people to land, memory, and matrilineal cosmology. And I guess you could say after the colonisation of the Taino people, Atabey sort of disappeared and faded from public knowledge. And in the Renaissance, there was, as we know, a European revival of Greco-Roman antiquity, but indigenous American cultures were still broadly categorised as uncivilised or infantile. So you had sort of classical goddesses like Athena being rediscovered and reinterpreted in art and literature, but Atabey was omitted from this intellectual resurgence. European writings on the Americas during this time, such as those by Bartolomé de las Casas or Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, largely described Taino spiritual life from a paternalistic or ethnocentric viewpoint, and they often depicted Atabey and other deities as part of a naive belief system in desperate need of Christian correction. Can you believe it? Well, you can believe it, can't you? But the intellectuals of the Renaissance, though they were open to exploring non-Christian traditions of the past, they still remained silent or dismissive of what was practiced by colonised people, particularly when these people were subjected to enslavement and displacement. So in this way, you could sort of say that Renaissance thinkers contributed to this almost cultural amnesia surrounding Atabey by privileging European paganism over indigenous cosmologies. And then we get around to the Enlightenment period, which brought an even more sort of aggressive challenge to Atabey's existence, with its elevation of this concept of reason and empirical science and humanist values, ironically framed almost entirely from a European perspective, might I add. Indigenous belief systems were labelled as irrational and incompatible with progress. And I think when you think about it, we're still a bit like that today. You know, we are very quick to call places third world countries and just assume that some countries are underdeveloped and don't have any sense of modernity. So I feel like a lot of this belief has trickled through even to now. And Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire promoted the secularization of society, but didn't really show much interest in preserving or understanding the spiritual practices of colonized people. Natural history texts of the time began cataloguing indigenous myths in the same way that they classified flora and fauna, just through a lens of purely objectification. And in doing so, figures like Atabey, they were sort of stripped of any sacred significance and they were reduced to just anthropological curiosities. And this wasn't merely erasure, but it was a total reconfiguration of indigenous belief into categories that denied its legitimacy as knowledge. And then we get round to the Victorian era, where we have this Western fascination with the primitive and the exotic. And this began to bring indigenous symbols back into aesthetic discord, although in very dismissive and distorted forms. The Victorians were really captivated by romantic and gothic depictions of ancient cultures, and goddesses like Atabey were sometimes appropriated into fictional or symbolic registers that had very little to do with her original meaning. In the context of Victorian literature and myth-making, powerful female figures were often framed as either monstrous and dangerous to the patriarchal order or mystical, so they were more aestheticised but disempowered. And there's a really interesting document that I read by Chen, and I'll pop that in the show notes. But in this article, Chen observes that monstrous femininities in Victorian literature mirrored deeper anxieties about gender, empire, and control. In this cultural milieu, Atabey could resurface, but only as a fractured echo of herself, marginalised, eroticised, or romanticised in ways that served colonial fantasies rather than indigenous realities. Her original role as a nurturing yet formidable force, central to Taino cosmology and environmental stewardship, was completely absent, and she was there, as I said earlier, as a curiosity, as a form of aesthetic entertainment, and it really stripped back any kind of cultural significance or importance that she actually had to indigenous people. The trajectory of Atabey's transformation from this revered creator goddess to a forgotten and appropriated figure reflects the broader arc of colonial and post-colonial thought. Her silencing during colonisation, her misrepresentation during the Enlightenment, and her almost fetishization in the Victorian era illustrate how colonialism dismantled complex spiritual traditions and reconstituted them in the service of empire. Yet in recent decades, there has been a bit of a resurgence in indigenous cultural movements across the Caribbean that seek to reclaim Atabey not as a relic, but as a living spiritual force tied to ecological resilience, gender empowerment, and ancestral identity. So let's have a little look at where we can find Atabey today. As I said, Atabey has had somewhat of a notable resurgence in the modern cultural imagination, and that includes things like literature, film, music, and feminist thought. And once she was confined to the mythologies of the indigenous Caribbean people, but her presence today signals both a cultural revival and a powerful symbol of resistance, environmental consciousness, and spiritual feminism. In literature, Atabey has appeared most strikingly in speculative and feminist texts that seek to reframe colonial and patriarchal narratives. For instance, Karen Lord's novel Unravelling portrays a goddess figure modelled after Atabey, described as a progenitor of divinity, symbolising not only origin but also agency and maternal sovereignty. And then there's also She Tries Her Tongue, Her Silence Softly Breaks by Marlene Norby's Phillip, and that draws on Atabey as part of a larger feminist reimagining of black and indigenous female bodies and their erasures under colonialism. And that is one I really, really want to read. So we'll be adding that to my TBR. But it's these sort of depictions that aim to really reclaim Atabey as a symbol of embodied resistance and decolonial feminism, which I think is so bloody badass. I nearly swore then, but I think it's so cool. I love that so much. And we can also see a really strong eco-feminist perspective in Elizabeth de Lowry and Tatiana Flores' work on Caribbean art. And what they do is they kind of examine the representations of submerged bodies and sea deities like Atabey in ecological resistance narratives. Atabey here becomes emblematic of the ecological crisis as well as spiritual resilience. And that ties into this sort of broader trend of goddess feminism explored by authors like Magulik, who reclaim goddesses like Atabey to critique both gender oppression and environmental degradation in modern capitalist societies. And again, I'm going to put all the links and all of the references and stuff in the show notes, so you can go and check out all of these books, because there is some really incredible literature out there that tackle things both from a colonial or a decolonial perspective, from a gender perspective, and from an ecological perspective. And there's lots of crossover. It's really, really interesting. There's lots of intersectionality there, and I'd 100% recommend that you go and check those out. In contemporary art and performance, Atabey is very much present in things like Ana Mendietta's earth body artworks, which invoke Atabey through ritualistic imprints and sacred feminine forms embedded in natural settings. And her work is often read through a feminist and a diasporic lens that reclaims indigenous identity and female agency. And then we've also got theatre and performance. So there's US Latina playwrights like Myrna Godsey, and they have integrated Atabey in re-spiritualised landscapes that challenge colonial religious frameworks and gender binaries. And it crosses over into music and spirituality. Atabey is referenced within Afro-Caribbean and diasporic rituals, often intertwined with Yoruba and Santeria practices. Yolanda Sangweni's African goddess initiation presents Atabey as a nurturing moon mother, guiding black women's spiritual reconnection with ancestral femininity. In bomba and other traditional Puerto Rican musical forms, references to Atabey are often coded, using a mode of cultural resistance and gender affirmation. Film and TV are probably a little bit more tentative in their embrace of Atabey, but elements of her symbolism have definitely filtered into speculative and Afro-Caribbean inspired visual narratives. For instance, the TV show Taina, which is a Latina protagonist that subtly nods to Taino roots, and Louise Erdrich's Future Home of the Living God evokes Atabey-like imagery when depicting a future where female fertility becomes a site of both oppression and resistance. And though they are indirect, these types of representations reflect the mythological undercurrent, so to speak, that Atabey inspires, things like fertility, origin, control over your own body, and ecological harmony. And really interestingly, Atabey has also emerged in feminist psychology and counselling, notably in Comas Diaz's work on Puerto Rican migrant women, and she notes how cultural anchors like Atabey serve as vital sources of identity, of healing and empowerment amid transnational dislocation and systemic violence. And finally, Atabey figures heavily in the literature of resistance and eco-spiritual activism, such as Joni Caputi's Call Your Mother, which positions Atabey as a symbol of earth-based activism and anti-anthropocentric thought. And Caputi underscores how reverence for earth mothers like Atabey provide an urgent counter-narrative to the destruction wrought by colonial patriarchal capitalism. And these modern invocations of Atabey illuminate her continuing relevance as a feminist, ecological and spiritual figure. She's far from just a sort of a relic of the Taino mythology. She is being reimagined as an active agent in the cultural and intellectual resistance to ongoing colonial legacies, environmental collapse and patriarchal systems of control. So there you go. Atabey is not a relic of the past at all by any means. She is a living archetype. She's a sacred current flowing still through Caribbean identity, feminine power and ecological consciousness. Her story isn't just one of survival, but it's one of transformation across time, across diaspora and resistance. And I really hope that you've enjoyed today's episode. If you have, like I said, please do feel free to follow or subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. You can find me over on TikTok and Blue Sky. All of the links will be in the show notes. And if you have enjoyed the episode, do feel free to leave me a comment or a review. Every single one genuinely makes me so happy, and I'm so grateful. And if you fancy checking out the Patreon, you absolutely can. A lot of the stuff on there is absolutely free. And if you fancy having a listen to Heroines of History, you can subscribe to the Patreon, or you can actually just listen to each individual episode if you want to. You can just pick and choose. It comes under, I think, the shop option over on Patreon. But once again, I really do appreciate you taking the time to listen to the podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll be back next week to unravel another thread in the rich tapestry of women in mythology and folklore.